Hello, everyone. This is Nick Ottinger with Team Conti Sim Performance, taking you around some laparoos at Darlington Xfinity Series. It's going to be our Week 12 battleground, I would say. But yeah, so let's get started here. You know, Darlington is as they say, it's pretty tough to tame. But realistically, it is more induced by the driver and how their mentality and mindset is to really be active in hitting the lines they need to. So obviously we're starting our first lap here. The biggest thing here at this track, and this is just my personal belief, is you really have to make sure you're just focused on your momentum. It's an abrasive and really tough track to get your marks kind of angled how you want, and that's really because of how rewarding it is for drivers to think they can drive into the corner deeper than they need to. But this track's more momentum based. It is really dependent on how you're getting that lateral grip activated and not slipping the right rear specifically. So turn one, your objective, my objective a lot of times is just get in there, not as soft as possible, but with as least amount of resistance to the front tires once I load into the banking of turn one. And really the same thing in turn four. So turn one, we have a lot of banking that just is really abrupt and more speed and entry speed than we would have for turn three. And a lot of times people will start really skewing the rear end out a little too much. And if you're doing that, more often than not, as a driver, it's indicative of too much wheel inputs and too much entry speed into when you're loading into turn one. So that is, it's hard to dictate a lot of times how much is too much entry speed. And if you're feeling the rear of the car, swing. Just really swing by when you're turning off the wall, and you still have throttle input while you're actually shaping to your almost match wheel input to the left like we have here. A lot of times that is just not lifting early enough and too much wheel input, swinging the rear end around too much. And while you actually have all that wheel input into it and you're decelerating, that'll swing the rear end around, and you're just not straight lining the entry as much as you can. So you're really putting a lot of movement, chassis movement to the rear when you need to be stable to obviously load into turn one. To kind of dissect turn one and two a little bit here as well, since we're on like lap 5 of this run. It's really it's a characteristic where you need to think about just stable momentum, and that's really your initial throttle to stabilize the car, okay, when you return back to it, and we'll explain it here. See, in turn one, lift, get on into the almost where we're touching the apron and dash line. Sometimes we'll do that here as well, and that is just to stabilize the entry so we have enough room to work up the hill and really dive to a consistent and stable balance. This Xfinity car, is pretty prone to having some lateral balance issues in the right rear, especially when you get closer and closer to the wall in 1 and 2. And objectively speaking, you just have to kind of mitigate that by just staying patient on the throttle. As you can see, I'm not really working to 100% throttle anywhere until I know I have the car straight for the exit of turn 2. And it's important. I mean, it's very important to make sure we have that trait where we're not just stabbing the gas and breaking it free and having some lateral issues, especially to the right rear tire this week. So we're going to have a lot of fall off, I think over a 30 lap run. Objectively speaking, it's probably going to be the hottest we've had Darlington in a recent, I would say, seasons. Probably be anywhere from 110 track temp and above to where we've been mid 80s to mid 90s. So some pace is going to be decreased ultimately on the start of the run, and that's going to dissipate obviously the harder you drive into the corners, harder you're responding back to the throttle, and just the harder you're actually tugging on the wheel. So as you can see, I'm doing as best I can just to keep it smooth, rapid, as low as I can off of turn 2, and sometimes that's going to change, obviously, when you actually get some tire life away from these tires to rely on. But still on 3 and 4 here, we're keeping a consistent line here. So, turn 1, we're going to talk about this again. This is going to change each progressive 10 laps that you do. It doesn't matter if it's in a race, because you're going to have a lot of variables that's going to change during a race, and that's going to be ultimately whether your wind direction, your wind speed, will probably change as well in the race as well. So it's going to be pretty dynamic and variables in that to think on. And I'm going to stop this here, kind of dissect these first 10 laps with you. Again, tire fall off, really important. I mean, that's really just important to understand. Like, we went the first lap, we're half a second quicker than what we were here. Okay, so we started at like a 44, 43, and now we're down to a 94 at lap 10. So again, tire preservation is probably the most important at this track and Dover when we come to Xfinity Series, and that is just it's just how this track is. You know, like if you want to have a good long run, driver can help induce that, whether the car is having some handling traits or not. And ultimately, it's just how you're shaping the wheel, and obviously responding back to the throttle, and not doing a lot of micro adjustments in the wheel. So let's kind of dissect these first 10 laps. I'm gonna go back to this last lap and let's dissect that specifically. I'm going to slow this down so you guys can kind of see a lift point ultimately. And you can tell it is well before we get to the signage on the inside of the wall here. And that's, again, look at this. Let's slow this down, completely lifting before I'm shaping a lot of wheel input and turning away from the wall. As you can see, look, completely in a rolling phase. And that's just to make sure we're getting into the entry phase with not yanking too much wheel input initially and working to our max wheel input into turn 1 as soft and least resistance as possible. You can tell we touched the apron here. You don't always have to do that. That is sometimes just to make sure you have enough room when you're working up this hill right here. Obviously when you're back to the throttle. So when you're working back to the throttle, you have these seams that we're crossing right here. The first seam off the dash lines, and then the top seam that you're going to be crossing with the right sides and keeping the left sides basically right on top of this seam when you get into the Darlington sign in the middle of 1 and 2. So you can tell I'm not working 100% throttle. If you're working back to 100% throttle, you've really softened your entry approach and you're trying to regain too much time to this point. And that is important because then you've had a lot of momentum loss initially that you're having to regain. So while you're working up here, you can tell very minimal throttle change. And you got to really start being proactive in understanding where you can start shaping to come off of this wall in 1 and 2. That is a really important quality to understand. So if you want to have a tire balance per se, and I'll go show you guys a chase view out of the car so you can understand as well. You want to have a tire sensation in this car, sometimes you have to change how you're loading the front end up. And that could be you need actually 5 to 10% more throttle and wrapping a little bit longer and staying up higher here, and then completely decelerating off the gas to help you kind of have a straighter exit of turn 2. Or you can have a little bit of a consistent gradual approach down off the wall to crossing these seams to get to this dash line a little bit earlier. Too early, you're going to have a exit that is going to sharpen and get as close to the walls that you probably do not want. So it is really important to understand where you're actually getting this left side as close to this seam and hitting this seam at the most. Okay, to relay that at the most, you don't want to get the left front activated under these dashed lines, because all you're going to do once you do that, you're going to actually push the car up with all the throttle input you have and wheel input. It's going to actually create a tight sensation and you're going to get offline. And it's very important to make sure you're just having a consistent line from turning off the wall all the way in the middle of 1 or 2 and carrying that to the exit of turn 2 here. You can tell here, like I'm keeping the left front activated right on this seam, and that's the lowest point I'm going to get. And you can tell how easy it is to actually work to keeping this down and then working to 100% throttle to make sure I'm not creating a push loose in the car with too much wheel input, or just in general a loose condition when I actually plant that throttle and battle all that lateral rear grip. So that's the exit of turn 2. And it's pretty consistent that way. There's going to be a couple of things we're going to change later on in the run, um, that we're probably going to be proactive in just carrying that part throttle further until we get to basically like right here, so we can actually have a straight exit and not have so many micro adjustments and work too hard in the car. I'm going to slow down to turn 3 here. Personally, I just come off the wall. This is just what I do. I do it in a cup car, do it in Xfinity and truck. Sometimes I come off the wall because that turn 3 entry, and we'll work to it right here. You'll notice it's a pretty flat entry here. And you'll notice the walls start tapering outward to have a wider entry. So that is kind of induced what do you want to do as a driver? Do you want to use this marker where this bend kind of starts outward to start carrying your straight line entry, which you'll be doing the same type of approach in the turn 1, right? Like you're going to be braking as straight as possible with the least amount of wheel input, not creating a loose condition on entry? Or, do you want to actually have a little bit later of an entry and use too much brake while you're actually trying to get into this banking? For me, I like to lift and use this turning point right at that bend, and you can tell how much brake pressure I'm using. It's not a ton, but it's enough to actually break this car a little bit free if you're carrying too much entry speed. And otherwise, if you're carrying too much speed because you're braking too late. As you can tell, when I load into 3 here, we go into this little compression zone. We're loading into the banking, and then we're loading the compression right here in the front. And then we're doing the same thing in the rear as soon as it crosses that point. Our objective here is much like turn 2, where we had that activating the left front right on these dashed lines and the seam. That's the lowest point you really want to get to, far as your center to exit. Because if we enter on, this is what I would call the apron, okay? Like this is the apron, and then this is meeting to the actual track, our racing line on the racing surface here. If you do that, like you might have the ability to turn and roll up to a small diamond in the middle of 3 and 4, but then you're gonna start costing yourself some momentum for your exit. So that's why it's important to make sure if you're gonna run this line, just keep it down there as much as possible. And you can tell, I'm gonna rewind it here. You can tell the center, we're hugging this as much as possible. We have a lot of rolling zone, and by the time we get to the Darlington logo, this is lap 10 of a run, we're back into the throttle. But you can tell we're not back into it 100%. What we're doing here is making sure we're not carrying such a tight sensation, and that's going to happen a lot of times if you're actually feeling tight and you pick up the throttle. Two things are going to happen majority of the times. Like if you keep the same amount of wheel input, you're going to start shoving the front end and you're going to get offline. Or if it starts where this is pretty active at a track like this, if it starts to actually break free once you give it that initial throttle input, that's where you have to be mindful. Okay, that's probably just too much initially. Then I got to work that down and keep that consistent, and then work to a linear throttle position to 100%, as you can tell what I'm doing here. So that's pretty simple on what you need to do. This car is going to break some traction once you cross these seams off of turn 4. If you having this low consistent exit and consistent line through 3 and 4, that's just how this track is. You're going to start battling some of these issues, and that's pretty much just something you can kind of induce. Okay, let's just worry about a straight exit. It's what cup drivers do all the time. They figure out how, if they have to enter the wall in 3 and 4, or in the middle, or the bottom, they're doing the best avenues to get clean air, obviously, to the front. But they're thinking about how they can get to their tipping point of 100% throttle with not sliding or spinning the rear tires consistently. They don't want to battle all this lateral issues, and this is the same thing in the Xfinity car. You don't want to battle all these lateral grip issues, you want to be able to be active enough to create that grip by straight lining your exit as much as possible. So let's go to a chase view. We'll do a couple laps here. See how you guys want to look at this. So you can get the outside perspective, and we'll kind of diagnose this. You can tell how close the right rear gets to the wall and how you got to kind of propel this down. So I'm going to change the camera view here a little bit for you guys. Keep it simple. I'm going to kind of get a little easier viewpoint. Again, bend here, you can tell that's my marker basically where I'm going to get the highest and peak to the wall and turn down. You can tell how much pressure I'm using. You can tell how possibly free it is because of how straight braking I have with the wheel input and everything like that. So once I load into the corner, obviously I'm using a little, trail braking a little bit at a slower process, but it's also kind of abruptly where it's going to be happening because you're compressing so quick, and then you got to make sure you're actually keeping on the right line. So you don't want to overslow your entry. And again here, you're going to notice this Darlington sign right here. It's going to be a good point where I'm picking up the throttle. And you can tell how I'm trying to keep this left front down to have all the grip to exit without correcting the right rear as much. When you get well into a run past 30, even at 30, it's really starting to be active around 20 to 25 when you have about a second and a half of fall off. You're going to notice that right rear start going and going and going and just going away. So once you cross these seams, it's important just to, okay, let's just modulate the throttle and wheel input to keep it a neutral balance as much as possible, or erring on the side of a tighter balance so you can actually think about exiting as straight as possible. So we're going to let this go for a couple laps, kind of showcase what this does, but I'll talk with you guys about kind of lane variations as well. Like you can tell here, we're just in a solo car. You know, we're running the bottom. That's probably going to be the easiest to have a defensive entry, but that leaves you prone to some guys trying to torch their tires as well, running the middle to top in 3 and 4. And why that is, you know, because you got a little bit more banking to use in the middle of 3 and 4, and you're not having to pinch your center and slow your center speed down to run the bottom of 3 and 4, like you would, you know, be active in carrying that roll speed and entry speed all the way into the center of 3 and 4. So there's going to be a couple points where we're going to be utilizing a diamond trait in 3 and 4, and that's putting the right sides above the seam, and even sometimes the left. Like you can enter in the middle. The track's probably going to be pretty important to understand how much it's being dynamic and changing. And if it's getting hotter and hotter, you don't really want to induce a lot of swing into the rear of the car. So what I mean by that is you don't want to, if you're going to enter the center of the track and you're going to go up towards the wall, that's probably going to be active in where you have a lot of ability to get to turning off the wall like you would in middle 1 and 2 right here. Let's put it like here. Like when you're turning off the wall here in 1 and 2, you're going to have a similar trait possibly in 3 and 4 where you're turning off the wall probably around the sport clip sign fully, or at the Geico sign, completely off that wall. But a lot of times, this is what I was talking about earlier, you want to carry that possibly same handling trait further and then kind of lift a little bit later, just to make sure you have a good balance and not swinging the rear end of the car out too early. And what that's going to induce sometimes is you might get a little free sensation too early when you kind of do it like you would at lap 5 and turn it down early, around that sport clip sign, and create a loose condition crossing those seams. So that's similar characteristics you're going to have in 3 and 4, you know, if we're in the top. You can enter, obviously we're entering here, but let's just say you put half of the car above the seam. And there's a lap or two I done in this replay so you guys can kind of see that. But you're going to be kind of using that Darlington sign, the logos here, as a good indicator as well, to probably turn down or keep running a consistent line here until you get a straighter exit. Because that's all you're battling is a straighter exit. So, what you got to be proactive in, understanding where your limited grip is, and whether it's in front, like if you're just tight, you probably got a little bit too much wheel input and not enough throttle, or you're probably just getting too much speed, center to exit with too much wheel input and causing a push loose. So it's pretty. This track's pretty fluent and dynamic in what you need to do to get the most out of the Xfinity car a lot of times. And a lot of those times it's just letting the car work. It's really that simple. Just letting the car work and have a good advantageous point for it to come back at a certain point. So it's pretty active, and this car, this is Dover, this is Darlington, like I mentioned, where you're gonna have the most amount of fall off and really need to worry about managing your tires from the onset of a run. So this is where you can get trapped a lot, when racing guys trapped racing their dirty air, and you're in a situation where you're kind of sandwiched from, you got a car in front of you, a car length, two car lengths, maybe a car behind you, a car length, two car lengths, three car lengths. Like, there's a point where you just got to understand, okay, let's not abuse these tires. Let's just race the racetrack. And you have to race the racetrack here. You got to race the racetrack and not race others. You got to race the racetrack by just managing your tires, getting this car working as efficient as you can, lap after lap after lap. So, as you can tell, we started at a 30.4 lap 1. By lap 18, basically here, we're about at a 31.7. So again, you have a lot of fall off. And the more you save at the beginning of the run, the more tire life you're going to have for the second half of your fuel run. So just something to always think about. And you can tell, first lap, I was pretty much running on this apron almost. But now you're starting to see a little bit of a trend where I'm diamonding up a little bit at this Darlington logo, putting half of the car above this seam. And this is just to create some center momentum into the center, but also I'm at this point I'm thinking about I need to have a good exit. I need to have a more active exit to where I'm not battling as a loose condition as much as possible when I'm trying to work to my tipping point of initial throttle, but also 100% throttle moment so I can actually be consistent in it. So you can tell I was a little aggressive in my approach back to initial throttle, but I'm keeping that until I cross the seam. And if I'm 100% throttle when I cross the seam, a lot of times it's going to break it free. So I'm keeping that car balanced to help with my straight line exit of forest. So always keep that in mind. These seams are pretty important to understand, just not to create a loose condition or tight condition. Just try to keep it as neutral as possible. So I'm going to go around to about lap 27, 28 here, and kind of showcase you guys the difference of what can, our lift points, all that stuff. So going to cockpit here, give you guys a couple laps. Similar to what we just talked about last lap, for the past minute, how I'm changing the line and moving forward. You can tell how much I've lifted earlier compared to the first part of a run. I'm lifting earlier, still having a little bit more of a approach when I'm in a rolling phase with turning and shaping the wheel. And here you can tell I'm battling a little bit more grip issues. You don't have to be afraid to use wheel input to turn the car. I mean, you're not shearing the fronts more often than not at this point of a run, unless you really work the right front off of it with too much pace. I'd say the first 10 to 15 laps. So you can tell here just how much throttle input I'm keeping it, and I'm battling a free condition obviously here. So that's just what happens at this track. Your grip dissipates quite heavily, through a 30 lap run, and then just think about how that is for a whole fuel run. So if you're ever in a situation where you need to obviously focus on making it to the end of a run, I would just be active in not pushing the first 15 to 20 laps of that run, and just worry about what you need to do for fuel. All right, this lap you could tell, same thing. I'm pretty heavily different on the line here, showcasing you guys what the middle is. Running the middle, that's a pretty decent line. Carry a good exit of turn 4, and you're going to be involving in some lane changes. You're going to be battling some dirty air people ahead of you, so just always remember that. That grip goes away. So we have a little bit of a different entry approach this time compared to the last lap. And I still have a good exit of turn 4, just not as quite as efficient of the momentum I created the lap prior. So that is, some important qualities to kind of look at. I'll go to a chase view so you guys can kind of view the last 2 laps here, the differences of what I did. And yeah, I mean, it's a pretty active track, pretty fun track. It's just you really got to drive the track and not drive racers into making mistakes yourself. That's the easiest part to actually do at a track like this is get out of line, got to sync on what you need to do, throttle input wise. You're driving to the corner deeper because someone else is driving in deeper. So there's a lot of games people play to kind of put you into a mistake. And if you're just focused on hitting your marks and entry and lift points, more often than not, you're going to be successful in just finding the limits that you need and finding lap time by just making sure you're getting the most out of it. Whether it's backing your pace up or whatever. I mean, that's what I would do if I'm going to a Coke race. Darlington, I'm always thinking about, hey, let's just manage my pace, manage my spot I'm starting in, and so work my way forward by just kind of conserving some tire life. And if I'm in clean air, I got even more advantageous reasons to manage my stuff and put the field behind me in a worse spot tire life wise. So make them drive harder where you're just driving at your consistent pace, and you're working to the lanes that you need to as effective as possible. So that is laps at Darlington Speedway. So I appreciate you guys tuning in.